I used to think loyalty was a virtue until I discovered it could be weaponized against you. My name is Sarah Martinez, and for 12 years I believed I was living proof that second marriages could work, that blended families could thrive, and that love really could conquer all. I was wrong about everything except the part where love conquers. It just wasn't conquering what I thought it was. The day I found the bank statement showing a $500,000 withdrawal to Jessica Chen, my husband's ex-wife, was the day I realized I'd been funding my own betrayal for over a decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the devil isn't just in the details, it's in the timing, the trust, and the 1,000 tiny compromises that led me to become an ATM for a woman who hated my existence. I met David Chen when I was 32, recently divorced myself, and working as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company in Denver. He was everything my first husband wasn't: confident without being arrogant, financially stable without being obsessive about money, and most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in building a partnership rather than acquiring a trophy wife. Our first date lasted 6 hours, spanning dinner, a late movie, and coffee afterward, where we talked until the cafe started stacking chairs around us. David was 40 then, with salt and pepper hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and laugh lines that suggested he'd actually enjoyed his life despite going through what he described as an amicable divorce 2 years earlier. He had twin daughters, Madison and Morgan, who were 8 at the time, and when he talked about them his entire demeanor softened in a way that made my heart skip. I'd always wanted children, but my first marriage had ended before we'd gotten that far, and at 32 I was starting to worry I'd missed my chance at the family I'd always dreamed of. Our courtship was refreshingly normal. David picked me up for dates, opened doors, and always walked me to my apartment afterward without assuming he was invited in. He brought me flowers, not expensive arrangements, but simple bouquets from the grocery store that somehow felt more thoughtful than anything elaborate. When I met Madison and Morgan 6 months into our relationship, they were shy but polite, and I could see they were still processing their parents' divorce, even though David assured me it had been mutual and peaceful. Jessica, David's ex-wife, was a different story entirely. Our first meeting happened at Madison's soccer game, where I'd come to cheer on the girls as David's girlfriend. Jessica arrived 20 minutes late, breathless and beautiful in that effortless way some women manage even when they're clearly frazzled. She had long black hair that caught the light, designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and the kind of figure that made other women instinctively suck in their stomachs. When David introduced us, Jessica's smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. She looked me up and down with the efficiency of a price scanner and apparently found me acceptable enough not to cause a scene in front of the children. Throughout the game, she made pointed comments about inside jokes I couldn't understand, referenced memories I hadn't shared, and generally made it clear that while I might be dating their father, she would always be their mother, and therefore hold a position I could never achieve. I tried to brush off the obvious territorial marking. After all, divorce was complicated, and I imagined it couldn't be easy to watch your ex-husband with someone new, especially around your children. David assured me that Jessica was just protective and would warm up to me eventually. He painted their divorce as the result of growing apart rather than any dramatic betrayal or incompatibility, two people who'd married young and simply become different people over time. What I didn't understand then was that Jessica Chen was the kind of woman who viewed every relationship as a zero-sum game. In her mind, David's happiness with me directly diminished something that belonged to her, and she would spend the next decade making sure I paid for that transgression in ways both subtle and devastating. Our wedding was small and intimate, held in David's backyard with about 50 guests. Madison and Morgan, then 10, walked down the aisle as junior bridesmaids wearing matching lavender dresses that Jessica had insisted on choosing. I'd wanted to include them in the decision, but David had gently suggested that since they spent weekends with their mother, it would be easier to let Jessica handle the details. It was the first of many compromises I'd make in the name of keeping peace with his ex-wife. Jessica arrived at the ceremony 15 minutes late, wearing a stunning black dress that was probably inappropriate for a daytime wedding but looked incredible on her. She'd brought a date, a handsome surgeon named Marcus, whom she introduced to everyone as her dear friend. Throughout the ceremony, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the emotional mother watching her children gain a stepmother. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like a gracious ex-wife who wanted only happiness for her former family. But I caught the looks she shot me when she thought no one was watching, the way her smile tightened when David kissed me after we were pronounced husband and wife, and the subtle way she managed to position herself in every family photo as if she still belonged there. When the photographer asked for a picture of just David, me and the girls, Jessica stepped forward with a laugh and said, "Oh, let me take this one. I know all their best angles." The honeymoon was blissful. David and I spent 2 weeks in Italy, exploring Tuscany and pretending we were newlyweds without any complications back home. We talked about our future, about maybe having a child of our own, about the house we'd buy once his divorce settlement was completely finalized. David mentioned casually that he was still paying Jessica alimony, which would continue for another 8 years, but he assured me it was manageable and would decrease over time as she presumably became more financially independent. When we returned to Denver, reality set in quickly. Madison and Morgan spent every other weekend with us, plus one evening during the week, and every interaction was carefully choreographed around Jessica's schedule and preferences. If the girls needed something for school, Jessica would text David directly rather than calling our house. If there was a change in pickup or drop-off times, Jessica expected David to accommodate immediately regardless of our plans. And if I ever suggested an activity or outing with the girls, David would inevitably preface it with, "Let me check with Jessica first." I tried to be understanding. Blended families were complicated, and I knew it would take time for everyone to adjust to our new dynamic. But as months passed, I began to notice patterns that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Jessica had a crisis every other weekend, usually on Friday afternoons, just as the girls were supposed to come stay with us. Her car would break down, or she'd have a work emergency, or she wouldn't be feeling well enough to drive, and somehow these crises always resulted in David having to rearrange our plans to accommodate her needs. The financial aspect of their relationship bothered me most, though I tried to keep my concerns to myself. In addition to the monthly alimony payments, David was constantly receiving requests from Jessica for additional money. Madison needed new soccer cleats, Morgan's violin required expensive repairs, there was a school trip that Jessica couldn't afford to cover, a medical expense that wasn't fully covered by insurance. Each request was reasonable in isolation, but collectively they added up to thousands of dollars beyond the agreed-upon alimony. When I gently suggested that perhaps Jessica should contribute more to these expenses since she had joint custody, David would get defensive. "She's their mother, Sarah," he'd say, as if that explained everything. "I want to make sure the girls have everything they need, and Jessica is doing her best as a single mom." The implication was clear, as their stepmother, I couldn't possibly understand the sacred bond between a parent and child, and any suggestion that Jessica should be more financially responsible was evidence of my selfishness rather than legitimate concern. A year into our marriage, David received a promotion that came with a significant salary increase. I was thrilled, thinking it would ease some of the financial pressure and maybe allow us to start trying for a baby of our own. Instead, the first thing David did was increase his monthly support payments to Jessica. When I asked why, he explained that since his income had gone up, it was only fair that his support should increase proportionally. "It's temporary," he assured me when I expressed concern about the amount. "Once Jessica gets back on her feet career-wise, she won't need as much help. She's been focused on the girls since the divorce, but now that they're older, she can start building her own financial independence." Jessica, as it turned out, had been getting back on her feet for the entire 3 years since their divorce. She'd started and abandoned several different career ventures, an online boutique that never materialized, a real estate license she'd obtained but never used, a personal training certification that led to exactly 0 clients. Each failed venture was explained away by circumstances beyond her control, the economy, bad timing, unexpected obstacles, and each failure was followed by another request for David to help bridge the gap until her next opportunity. Meanwhile, I was working 50-hour weeks, contributing equally to our household expenses, and watching my dreams of starting a family get postponed indefinitely, because David's financial obligations to his ex-wife left us with no savings for childcare or a larger home. When I tried to discuss this with David, he'd remind me that I'd known he had children and financial responsibilities when we got married, as if pointing this out made me a terrible person for wanting a life that didn't revolve entirely around Jessica's needs. The breaking point came during Madison and Morgan's 13th birthday party. Jessica had planned an elaborate celebration at an upscale event venue, complete with a DJ, professional photographer, and catered dinner for 60 guests. The cost was astronomical, easily $8,000 for a children's birthday party, and Jessica had presented David with the bill 2 weeks before the event. "I can't afford this," she'd told him over the phone, her voice taking on that breathless, helpless quality she used whenever she needed something. "But I already sent the invitations, and the girls are so excited. I don't know what to do, David. I can't disappoint them." Of course, David couldn't bear the thought of disappointing his daughters either. He agreed to pay for the entire party, despite the fact that we'd been saving for a down payment on a larger house, and the expense would wipe out 6 months of careful budgeting. When I suggested that perhaps the party could be scaled back, or that Jessica could contribute something toward the cost, David looked at me as if I'd suggested canceling Christmas. "It's their birthday, Sarah," he said, using that patient tone that made me feel like an unreasonable child. "They only turned 13 once, and Jessica put a lot of work into planning this. I can't just pull the rug out from under her now." The party itself was a testament to Jessica's talent for making everything about herself. She'd hired a photographer who took hundreds of pictures, but somehow I appeared in exactly 3 of them, always in the background or partially obscured. When it came time for the birthday toast, Jessica gave a speech about how proud she was of her babies, and how grateful she was to have such a supportive co-parent who understood that children always come first. David beamed at the praise, apparently missing the subtle implication that as their stepmother, I was somehow less invested in the girls' well-being. After the party, as we were cleaning up, I overheard Jessica talking to one of the other mothers about her situation. "It's so hard being a single mom," she was saying, her voice carrying just enough to ensure I could hear. "Financially, emotionally, everything falls on me. Thank goodness David is so generous with support, but even then, it's a constant struggle. I keep thinking I should get back to work full-time, but the girls need me so much right now, maybe when they're in high school."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I bit my tongue, but privately I fumed. Jessica lived in a beautiful townhouse in one of Denver's most expensive neighborhoods, drove a luxury SUV, and seemed to have plenty of time for yoga classes, spa days, and lunch dates with friends. If she was struggling financially, it wasn't because she lacked resources, it was because she'd chosen to treat David as her personal bank account rather than take responsibility for her own financial future. That night, as David and I were getting ready for bed, I finally voiced my concerns directly. "David, I need to talk to you about the money," I said, sitting on the edge of our bed. "The party tonight cost more than some people make in 3 months, and this is becoming a pattern. Every month, there's something else Jessica needs help with, and we're the ones making sacrifices to cover it." David paused in the middle of brushing his teeth, meeting my eyes in the bathroom mirror. "Sarah, they're my children. I'm not going to let them go without just to save money." "I'm not suggesting they go without," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm suggesting that Jessica contribute more to their expenses since she has joint custody, and I'm suggesting that maybe some of these extras like $8,000 birthday parties aren't actually necessities." David turned around, and I could see the familiar defensive wall going up in his expression. "Jessica is doing her best. Being a single mother isn't easy, and she gave up her career to focus on the girls after our divorce. The least I can do is make sure they have everything they need." "But what about what we need?" I asked, hearing my voice rise despite my efforts to stay calm. "We've been married 2 years, David, and we're still living in this tiny house because every time we save money, Jessica has another crisis. We can't even talk about having a baby because you're so focused on supporting your ex-wife that there's nothing left for our future." The argument that followed was our worst yet. David accused me of being jealous of his relationship with his daughters, of trying to come between him and his children, of being selfish and unrealistic about the responsibilities that came with marrying a divorced father. I accused him of being manipulated by Jessica, of prioritizing his ex-wife's comfort over our marriage, of being too guilty about the divorce to set appropriate boundaries. We went to bed angry, lying on opposite sides of the mattress like strangers. In the darkness, I wondered if this was how all marriages to divorced men went, if I'd doomed myself to always being second priority behind the ghost of his first family. But when David reached for my hand in the early hours of the morning, whispering apologies and promises to find a better balance, I let myself believe that love could conquer even this. The next few months brought a temporary peace. David made an effort to include me more in decisions about the girls, and Jessica seemed to have fewer crisis moments requiring immediate financial intervention. We started looking at houses again, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe we'd turned a corner in finding our equilibrium as a blended family. Then Madison started high school, and everything changed again. She needs a new laptop for her advanced classes, Jessica announced during a phone call that I could hear from the kitchen. And she's been accepted to the youth leadership program, which is a huge honor, but it requires a summer trip to Washington, D.C. I hate to ask, but with my work situation being what it is. Her work situation, as far as I could tell, hadn't changed in the 4 years since David and I had been together. Jessica had settled into a comfortable routine of part-time freelance marketing work that conveniently never seemed to generate enough income to cover her share of the girls' expenses. She lived in a perpetual state of just getting back on her feet, always one opportunity away from financial independence, always needing just a little more help to get there. David agreed to both the laptop and the leadership program, naturally. The combined cost was close to $4,000, money that came directly out of the savings we'd been rebuilding for our house fund. When I pointed this out, David sighed and gave me that look that said I was being unreasonable again. "It's an investment in Madison's future," he said. "This program could help her get into a top college, and she needs a good laptop anyway for her coursework. Would you rather she fall behind because we were too cheap to get her the tools she needs?" The way he phrased it made any objection I might have sound petty and cruel. Of course I wanted Madison to succeed, of course I supported her education, but I was starting to feel like we were funding Jessica's version of what the girls needed, while our own needs and dreams were perpetually deferred. The pattern continued through Madison's sophomore year. There were dance classes that Jessica couldn't afford, a spring break trip with her friends that required new luggage and spending money, a summer job opportunity that fell through at the last minute, leaving Jessica scrambling to find childcare she couldn't pay for. Each situation was presented as temporary, each solution involved David writing another check, and each check came with Jessica's grateful assurance that this was the last time she'd need to ask for help. Meanwhile, Morgan was developing her own expensive interests. She'd discovered theater and suddenly needed voice lessons, acting classes, and professional headshots. The high school drama program required parent volunteers, and Jessica made sure everyone knew how much she was contributing to her daughter's artistic development, often in conversations that somehow highlighted how busy she was, and how much financial sacrifice she was making for her children's dreams. The summer Madison turned 16, Jessica announced that she was finally ready to make a major career move. She'd been offered an opportunity to buy into a marketing consultancy with a former colleague, but she needed capital to make it happen. "This is it, David," she said, during a phone call that I heard from our bedroom. "This is my chance to finally build something stable. I know I've had false starts before, but this is different. Sarah's business partner has the client connections, I have the creative skills, and together we could really build something. But I need $50,000 to buy in, and with the girls' expenses, I felt my stomach drop. $50,000 wasn't just money, it was the down payment on the house we'd been saving for, the emergency fund we'd carefully built, the financial security I'd been working toward for the past 4 years of our marriage. When David came to bed that night, I was waiting for him. "Please tell me you're not seriously considering giving Jessica $50,000, I said before he'd even turned off the light. David sat heavily on his side of the bed, his shoulders sagging in a way that made him look older than his 47 years. "Sarah, this could be the answer we've been looking for. If Jessica's business takes off, she won't need support anymore. She could be completely financially independent. Or she could lose the $50,000 like she's lost money on every other business venture she's tried," I countered. "David, this is our future we're talking about. That money is supposed to be for our house, for our family, for our security." "Jessica is family too," David said quietly. "She's the mother of my children, If there's a chance this could work, there's always a chance, I interrupted. There was a chance the online boutique would work. There was a chance the real estate career would work. There was a chance the personal training would work. Jessica has been temporarily needing support for 5 years, David. When does temporary become permanent? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his expression was pained but determined. I can't abandon her, Sarah. She gave up her career for our marriage, for our children. I owe her this chance. She gave up her career for your first marriage, I corrected, feeling something cold settle in my chest. I didn't ask her to make that sacrifice, and she's been divorced for 6 years, David. At some point, she has to take responsibility for her own financial future instead of expecting you to fund it forever. The argument that followed was devastating. David accused me of being heartless, of not understanding the complexities of divorce and co-parenting, of being threatened by his commitment to his children's well-being. I accused him of being manipulated, of using guilt to justify terrible financial decisions, of caring more about Jessica's opinion of him than about our marriage. In the end, David gave Jessica $40,000, not the full $50,000 she'd asked for. He was careful to point out, as if his restraint somehow made the decision more reasonable. I watched 4 years of careful saving disappear overnight, watched our dreams of a larger home and a family of our own get sacrificed on the altar of Jessica's latest business venture. The marketing consultancy, predictably, failed within 8 months. Jessica's business partner turned out to be leveraging the company for her own debts, and when the partnership dissolved, Jessica lost her entire investment. She called David in tears, explaining how she'd been betrayed and taken advantage of. How she'd believed she was finally building something sustainable only to have it stolen from her by someone she trusted. I'm so sorry, David, she sobbed over the phone. I know how much faith you had in this, how much you invested. I feel like I've let everyone down. David comforted her with the same gentle patience he'd shown through every other failed venture, assuring her that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known her partner was dishonest, that the important thing was that she'd tried. And when Jessica mentioned that she was now behind on her mortgage, and might need help catching up until she could find steady work again, David didn't hesitate to offer assistance. That night, as I stared at our bank statement showing a balance that was lower than it had been when we'd gotten married, I realized something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of our relationship. David wasn't choosing Jessica over me out of malice or lingering romantic feelings. He was choosing her because guilt and obligation were more powerful motivators for him than love and partnership. Jessica had become a permanent fixture in our marriage, a third party whose needs would always supersede our own because David couldn't bear the thought of being seen as a bad father or an unsupportive co-parent. And I had become the woman expected to finance her own heartbreak, watching my husband give our future to his past, while being told I should be grateful for the privilege. As I sat in the darkness of our still too small house, surrounded by the remnants of dreams deferred indefinitely, I began to understand that the problem wasn't Jessica's manipulation or David's guilt. The problem was my own willingness to accept a marriage where I would always come second, where my needs would always be sacrificed for the sake of keeping peace with a woman who had never once expressed gratitude for my flexibility or acknowledgement of my sacrifices. The woman I'd been when I married David would have continued to make those sacrifices indefinitely, telling herself that love meant putting everyone else's needs before her own. But that woman had been slowly disappearing over the past 5 years, replaced by someone harder, more observant, and less willing to smile through her own diminishment. I was about to discover just how far that diminishment had gone, and how much more there was to uncover about the financial arrangement between my husband and his ex-wife. But that night, staring at our devastated bank account, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being understanding, done being flexible, and done funding my own destruction. Tomorrow I would start asking questions that I should have asked years ago. Tomorrow I would stop accepting David's explanations and start demanding proof. Tomorrow I would discover that the $40,000 business investment was just the tip of an iceberg that went deeper and darker than I could have possibly imagined. But tonight, I mourned the marriage I thought I'd had, and began planning for the woman I was going to become. The morning after I decided to stop being the understanding wife, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally acknowledging a truth you've been avoiding for years. David had already left for work, and I had the house to myself for the first time in weeks. Instead of my usual routine of checking emails and starting the laundry, I went straight to our home office and opened every financial document I could find. What I discovered in the first hour made me physically sick. The business investment wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern that stretched back to the beginning of our marriage. David had been giving Jessica money regularly, far beyond the court-ordered alimony, and he'd been hiding the full extent of it by categorizing the payments as various household expenses or depositing them from his personal account before our paychecks were combined. I found records of a $15,000 payment, labeled as home maintenance, that coincided with Jessica getting new hardwood floors. A $8,000 withdrawal marked as medical expenses that happened the same week Jessica posted photos of her vacation to Cabo on social media. Multiple payments of $2,000 to $5,000, scattered throughout every month, each one small enough that I might not notice it among our regular bills, but collectively adding up to more than we spent on our own household expenses. My hands were shaking as I printed out bank statements going back 3 years. The numbers were staggering. David had been giving Jessica an average of $12,000 per month beyond his official alimony payments. Over the course of our 5-year marriage, he'd transferred more than $500,000 to his ex-wife, money that could have bought us a house, funded our retirement, or given us the financial security to start a family. I sat in that office until past noon, surrounded by papers that documented the systematic drain of our financial future. Every vacation we hadn't taken, every restaurant meal I'd suggested we skip to save money, every time I'd worked overtime to boost our household income, it had all been meaningless because David was secretly funding Jessica's lifestyle to a degree that made my contributions irrelevant. When David came home that evening, I was waiting at the kitchen table with a folder full of printouts. He took one look at my face, and the papers spread in front of me, and I watched the color drain from his complexion. "Sarah," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. $567,000, I said, my voice eerily calm. "That's how much you've given Jessica over the past 5 years, not counting the official alimony." I spent the day going through every bank statement, every credit card bill, every account we have. "Would you like to explain to me how we went from having a healthy savings account when we got married to barely being able to afford a down payment on a house?" David sat down across from me, looking like a man facing execution. "Sarah, I can explain." "Please do," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I'm particularly interested in the $25,000 you gave her last Christmas that you told me was a bonus payment to your assistant. Or the $18,000 in March that was supposedly for roof repairs on our house, except our roof is fine. Or maybe you can explain the $6,000 monthly payments that have been automatically transferred to Jessica's account for the past 2 years, payments that don't appear anywhere in our budget discussions." David's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. "I know how this looks, but it's not what you think. Jessica has been going through a really difficult time financially, and the girls need stability. I couldn't just watch them struggle when I had the ability to help." "Help?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "David, you've given your ex-wife over $500,000 of our money. That's not help, that's a lifestyle subsidy, and you hid it from me for 5 years." "I didn't hide it," David protested weakly. I knew you wouldn't understand. You don't have children, Sarah. You can't possibly comprehend what it feels like to see your kid's mother struggling to make ends meet." The familiar refrain about my lack of children hit differently this time. Instead of the usual stab of guilt, I felt something cold and analytical settle over me. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't have children. And do you know why that is, David? Because every time we've tried to plan for a family, every time we've talked about buying a bigger house or saving for childcare, you've suddenly discovered another crisis in Jessica's life that requires our immediate financial intervention. I've been postponing motherhood for 5 years, while you funded your ex-wife's comfortable lifestyle." David flinched, but pressed on with his justifications. "The girls need things, Sarah. Good schools, extracurricular activities, clothes, technology. Jessica is doing her best, but she can't provide everything they need on her own. Madison and Morgan go to the same public high school I went to," I countered. "It's an excellent school, and their extracurricular activities cost more per year than some families spend on housing. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that you made these decisions without me, spending our shared money on your ex-wife's expenses, while lying to my face about where it was going. I pulled out one of the bank statements and pointed to a specific transaction. This is from January. A $12,000 payment to Jessica that you told me was for emergency car repairs for your mother. Your mother who has been dead for 3 years, David. You looked me in the eye and lied to me about giving money to Jessica, using your dead mother as cover. How exactly am I supposed to understand that? David's face crumpled, and I could see him grappling with the magnitude of what he'd been caught doing. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I should have told you, but I was afraid you'd try to stop me from helping them. And I can't abandon my children just because it's inconvenient for our marriage. No one is asking you to abandon your children, I said, my voice steady but cold. I'm asking you to stop abandoning your wife. I'm asking you to stop treating our marriage like a checking account for Jessica's benefit. And I'm asking you to explain to me how you thought it was acceptable to lie to me for 5 years about where our money was going. The conversation that followed was brutal. David alternated between defensive anger and tearful apologies, painting himself as a victim of impossible circumstances caught between his loyalty to his children and his love for me. He insisted that everything he'd done had been temporary, that he'd always planned to scale back the support once Jessica got back on her feet, that he'd never intended for it to go on so long. But as we talked, more details emerged that made the situation even worse. The townhouse where Jessica lived wasn't rented, it was owned, purchased with a down payment David had provided 3 years earlier. The luxury SUV she drove was leased under David's name, with payments automatically deducted from our account. Even Jessica's health insurance was being paid for by David, despite the fact that she was perfectly capable of getting her own coverage. She's the mother of my children, David repeated whenever I questioned a particular expense, as if that phrase was a magic incantation that justified any financial decision. I made a commitment to take care of them when we got divorced. I can't just abandon that responsibility because I remarried. What about your commitment to me? I asked, what about your responsibility to the woman you actually married? When you were writing checks to Jessica, did you ever once consider how those decisions would affect our future together? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was pained but resolute. Sarah, I love you, but Madison and Morgan are my daughters. They will always come first, and that means making sure their mother has what she needs to take care of them. If you can't accept that, then maybe, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If I couldn't accept being a permanent second priority behind Jessica's financial needs, then perhaps I didn't belong in his life at all. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me, apparently unburdened by our conversation. I realized that from his perspective, nothing had really changed. He'd been caught, he'd apologized, and now we would go back to our normal routine with perhaps a bit more transparency about Jessica's financial demands. In his mind, I would continue to be the understanding wife who made sacrifices for the sake of his children, because that's what love looked like to him. But something fundamental had shifted in me during that conversation. For the first time in our marriage, I saw David clearly not as the devoted father making difficult choices, but as a man who had chosen comfort over honesty, who had prioritized avoiding conflict with his ex-wife over building trust with his current wife. He had made me complicit in funding Jessica's lifestyle without my knowledge or consent, and when confronted with the betrayal, his primary concern was justifying it rather than acknowledging the harm it had caused. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the office of a divorce attorney. I told myself I was just gathering information, exploring options, trying to understand what my rights might be if the situation didn't improve. But deep down, I knew I was already preparing for a future that didn't include David. Margaret Sullivan was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in complex divorce cases involving financial deception. When I explained my situation, she listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about timelines and amounts. "This is financial fraud," she said bluntly when I finished. "Your husband used marital assets to benefit a third party without your knowledge or consent. In Colorado, you have grounds for divorce based on financial misconduct, and you're entitled to reimbursement for the funds that were improperly transferred." "But I signed joint tax returns," I protested. "I had access to our accounts." Couldn't he argue that I should have known what was happening? Margaret shook her head. Having access doesn't mean you consented to specific transactions, especially when your husband was deliberately hiding them from you. The fact that he categorized Jessica's support payments as household expenses shows intent to deceive, and using fake explanations for large withdrawals demonstrates a pattern of fraud that goes beyond simple non-disclosure. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers based on the figures I'd provided. Based on what you've told me, your husband has transferred approximately $567,000 in marital assets to his ex-wife over 5 years. If you divorce, you'd be entitled to reimbursement for half of that amount, plus your share of any remaining marital assets. You might also be entitled to spousal support, depending on the disparity in your incomes. The idea of actually divorcing David felt surreal, but hearing Margaret lay out the financial realities made the prospect less terrifying. I wouldn't be left destitute if I left him. In fact, I might be better off financially as a single woman than I was as David's wife funding Jessica's comfortable lifestyle. What would you recommend as a first step? I asked. Document everything, Margaret replied. Print out bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns, any evidence you can find of the transfers. If you decide to proceed with divorce, we'll need comprehensive financial records. Also consider opening your own bank account and redirecting your paychecks there. If your husband has been willing to deceive you about this much money, he might try to hide assets if he suspects you're planning to leave. I left Margaret's office with a folder full of legal information and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Whether or not I ultimately filed for divorce, I was done being the unknowing financier of Jessica's lifestyle. I was going to protect myself, document everything, and make sure that if David wanted to continue supporting his ex-wife, he'd have to do it with his own money rather than mine. The first thing I did was open a new bank account at a different institution, one where David had no access or knowledge. I arranged for my paychecks to be deposited there starting the following week, and I began the process of separating my financial life from his. If David noticed the change in our household income, he could explain it by reducing his payments to Jessica rather than expecting me to subsidize them. The second thing I did was hire a private investigator. I told myself it was just to verify the extent of David's financial support, to make sure I had the complete picture before making any major decisions. But I suspected there was more to discover about Jessica's true financial situation and her relationship with my husband. The investigator, a former police detective named Tom Rodriguez, agreed to look into Jessica's lifestyle and spending patterns. Within a week, he'd uncovered information that made David's support payments seem even more outrageous. Jessica wasn't struggling financially. She was living far better than most people in Denver, with expenditures that suggested an annual income of at least $200,000. The townhouse David had helped her purchase was now worth $400,000 more than she'd paid for it, making her wealthier on paper than David and I were combined. She'd been investing David's support payments in real estate and stock portfolios, building personal wealth, while claiming to be barely surviving as a single mother. More disturbing was the evidence Tom found of Jessica's manipulation tactics. She maintained detailed records of David's emotional vulnerabilities, noting which approaches were most effective for securing additional money. She tracked our financial situation through social media and mutual friends, timing her requests for support to coincide with David's bonuses or periods when our marriage seemed stable. Most damaging was a series of text messages Tom recovered between Jessica and her sister, where she openly discussed her strategy for maintaining David's support indefinitely. The key is never to ask for too much at once, one message read. Small, frequent requests work better than big ones, and always frame it around the girl's needs rather than mine. David's guilt about the divorce makes him easy to manipulate, especially when Sarah starts questioning the expenses. A few tears about struggling as a single mom, and he'll write any check I ask for. Another message was even more explicit. Sarah's getting suspicious about the money, but David's too guilty to cut me off. I just need to be more strategic about timing. Maybe a crisis right before their anniversary, something that requires immediate financial help. David won't risk looking like a bad father in front of his precious second wife. Reading those messages felt like being punched in the stomach. Jessica wasn't just taking advantage of David's guilt, she was actively undermining our marriage for her own financial benefit. Every crisis, every tearful phone call, every emergency that had required us to postpone our plans had been calculated manipulation designed to ensure that David's money kept flowing to her instead of building a future with me. When Tom showed me the evidence, I felt something inside me snap. The woman I'd been trying so hard to understand and accommodate for 5 years had been laughing at my expense, viewing me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person deserving of basic respect. "There's more," Tom said, pulling out another folder. "Jessica has been using David's support payments to fund a lifestyle that would be impossible on any legitimate income she might earn. But she's also been very careful to hide her true financial situation from him. She maintains 2 separate banking systems, one that shows constant financial stress, which she shares with David when requesting support, and another that shows her real wealth accumulation." He showed me evidence of Jessica's investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business ventures that were actually profitable but hidden from David's view. She owned 3 rental properties in addition to her primary residence, had over $300,000 in various investment accounts, and was a silent partner in several successful local businesses. "Your husband has been supporting a woman who is likely wealthier than both of you combined," Tom concluded.
And she's been systematically deceiving him about her financial status to maintain that support. I stared at the documents spread across Tom's desk, trying to process the magnitude of Jessica's deception. She wasn't just manipulating David, she was committing fraud on a massive scale, using his guilt and our marital assets to fund her secret wealth accumulation, while pretending to be a struggling single mother. "What are my options?" I asked Tom. "Legally, you have several routes," he replied. "You could confront your husband with this evidence and demand that he stop the payments. You could file for divorce and seek restitution for the fraudulently transferred funds, or you could report Jessica's fraud to the authorities, though that might complicate any divorce proceedings." I took copies of everything Tom had gathered and drove home in a daze. The woman I'd married had been systematically defrauded for 5 years, and I'd been an unwitting accomplice, funding Jessica's wealth accumulation with every dollar I'd contributed to our household. But as I sat in our driveway, looking at our modest house while knowing that David's support payments had helped Jessica build a real estate empire, I felt something other than just anger. I felt a cold, calculating fury that demanded not just confrontation, but justice. Jessica had spent 5 years treating me like a fool, viewing my marriage as a resource to exploit. She'd manipulated David's emotions, undermined our financial security, and delayed our dreams of starting a family, all while secretly building wealth that would have been unimaginable on her actual income. She'd made one critical mistake, though. She'd underestimated me. She'd assumed I would continue to be the understanding wife who accepted whatever explanation David offered, who prioritized harmony over truth, who would fund her lavish lifestyle indefinitely without question. But the woman who'd discovered her husband's financial betrayal was not the same woman who'd married him 5 years earlier. I'd been changed by years of watching my dreams deferred, my needs dismissed, and my contributions devalued. I'd learned to be suspicious, observant, and strategic. And now I was going to use those skills to make sure that Jessica Chen finally faced consequences for treating my marriage like her personal ATM. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, oblivious to what I'd learned about his precious ex-wife, I began planning the most important confrontation of my life. Jessica had built her comfortable lifestyle on lies and manipulation, funded by money that belonged to my marriage. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of tearing that life apart, piece by carefully documented piece. And this time, when it was over, Jessica would discover what it actually felt like to be a struggling single woman, while I reclaimed the future she'd stolen from me. I waited 3 weeks to make my move, using that time to gather every piece of evidence Tom had uncovered, and to finalize my own financial independence. By the time I was ready to act, I had documentation of Jessica's hidden assets, proof of her manipulation tactics, and a comprehensive record of every fraudulent payment David had made over 5 years. More importantly, I had a plan that would ensure both of them faced consequences for what they'd done to our marriage. The first phase was confronting Jessica directly, without David's knowledge or protection. I called her on a Tuesday morning when I knew she'd be alone, since Madison and Morgan were at school, and she typically spent her mornings at the expensive yoga studio David's support payments had helped fund. "Sarah," Jessica answered, her voice carrying that familiar note of surprise whenever I contacted her directly. "Is everything okay? Is David all right?" "David's fine," I replied, keeping my tone pleasant and casual. "Actually, I was hoping we could meet for coffee this morning. There are some things about the girls' expenses that I'd like to discuss with you, and I thought it might be better to talk without David getting caught in the middle of financial planning." Jessica paused, and I could practically hear her calculating whether this was an opportunity or a threat. "Of course," she finally said, "I'm always happy to discuss what's best for Madison and Morgan. Where would you like to meet?" I suggested a quiet cafe in her upscale neighborhood, knowing she'd feel comfortable on her home territory and more likely to let her guard down. When I arrived 20 minutes early, I chose a corner table where our conversation wouldn't be overheard, but where I had a clear view of the entire space. Jessica walked in precisely on time, looking polished and confident in expensive athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She spotted me immediately and approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, you look wonderful," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "It's so nice to have some one-on-one time. We never really get to talk without David managing the conversation." I smiled back, matching her false warmth. "That's exactly what I was thinking. There's so much about your situation that I don't really understand, and I feel like David sometimes protects me from the difficult realities you're facing as a single mother." Jessica's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her trying to determine whether I was being genuine or setting a trap. After a moment, she seemed to decide I was still the naive stepmother she'd been manipulating for years. "It has been challenging," she admitted, leaning forward conspiratorially. "David tries his best to help, but he doesn't really understand what it's like to manage a household on my limited income. Every month is a struggle to make sure the girls have what they need." I nodded sympathetically, pulling out a small notebook as if I were genuinely interested in understanding her financial situation. "That must be so difficult. I can't imagine trying to maintain your beautiful home and provide for Madison and Morgan on just your freelance income. How much are you typically able to earn from your marketing work?" Jessica's eyes flickered with caution, but she was too invested in maintaining her victim narrative to avoid the question entirely. "It varies," she said carefully. "Some months are better than others. Maybe $3,000 to $4,000 on a good month, but it's never consistent. And your housing costs must be significant." I continued, maintaining my concerned expression. "That townhouse is gorgeous, and I know property values in this neighborhood have really increased. You must be paying at least $4,000 a month in mortgage and taxes." "It's challenging," Jessica repeated, not providing specific numbers but allowing me to believe her housing costs consumed most of her claimed income. "David helped me secure the mortgage when we first divorced, but I've been managing the payments on my own since then." I made a note in my book, nodding thoughtfully. "It's amazing that you've been able to maintain that level of responsibility while building your freelance business. And you've been so smart about investing in the girls' futures too. The dance classes, the theater program, Madison's leadership activities, they're all such wonderful opportunities, but I imagine they add up quickly." Jessica preened slightly at the praise, clearly enjoying the recognition of her maternal dedication. "The girls' development is my priority," she said firmly. "I'll sacrifice anything to make sure they have every advantage, even if it means I go without things for myself." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I closed my notebook and leaned back, allowing my expression to shift from sympathetic to neutral. "That's interesting," I said calmly. "Because according to the financial records I've reviewed, you've been investing David's support payments quite strategically. Building a real estate portfolio, contributing to multiple investment accounts, accumulating wealth that most people could only dream of. It doesn't really align with the struggling single mother narrative you've been presenting." The color drained from Jessica's face, and I watched her scramble to regain her composure. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're completely wrong. I barely make ends meet every month." I pulled out my phone and opened the folder containing Tom's investigation results. "These are photos of your investment account statements, Jessica." Over $300,000 in various portfolios. Records of 3 rental properties you own in addition to your primary residence. Bank statements showing deposits that are inconsistent with the income level you just claimed. Jessica stared at the phone screen, her carefully maintained mask finally slipping to reveal something cold and calculating. Where did you get those? Those are private financial records. The same way you've been tracking our financial situation for the past 5 years. I replied, the same way you've been timing your requests for support to coincide with David's bonuses and our major expenses. I know about your manipulation tactics, Jessica. I know about the text messages to your sister, where you bragged about how easy it was to guilt David into writing checks. I know that every crisis, every emergency, every tearful phone call about struggling as a single mother has been carefully calculated fraud. Jessica's composure cracked completely. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed, her voice dropping to avoid attracting attention from other cafe patrons. David owes me that support. I gave up my career for our marriage, for his children. He destroyed my life when he decided he wanted someone younger and prettier. David didn't decide anything, I countered. You two got divorced by mutual agreement 3 years before I even met him. And you haven't sacrificed your career, you've built an incredibly successful one as a professional victim, extracting over $500,000 from my marriage while pretending to be financially desperate. That money was for Madison and Morgan, Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction now. Some of it might have been, I agreed, but most of it went directly into your personal wealth accumulation, while you manipulated David's guilt about the divorce. You've been systematically defrauding us, Jessica, using his love for his children as a weapon against our marriage. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to determine how much I actually knew and what I planned to do with the information. Finally, she leaned forward, her expression shifting to something almost predatory. What do you want? She asked quietly. I want it to stop, I replied. All of it. The fake financial crises, the manipulative requests for support, the interference in my marriage. David's official alimony obligations end in 2 years, and when they do, that's the end of his financial relationship with you. No more emergency requests, no more business investments, no more lifestyle subsidies, disguised as child support. Jessica laughed bitterly, and you think David will just agree to that? He's too guilty about the divorce. Too worried about being seen as a bad father. I know exactly which buttons to push to get what I need from him. Not anymore, I said calmly, because David is going to see the same evidence I'm looking at right now. He's going to learn about your hidden assets, your manipulation tactics, and your systematic fraud, and then he's going to have to choose between continuing to enable your lies or salvaging what's left of our marriage. You're bluffing, Jessica said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. David will never believe you over me. I'm the mother of his children. I stood up, gathering my things with deliberate calm. We'll find out, won't we? But Jessica, I want you to understand something very clearly. The woman you've been manipulating for 5 years doesn't exist anymore. I'm not the naive stepmother who accepted whatever explanation David offered. I'm not going to smile and nod while you steal our future. And I'm certainly not going to continue funding your comfortable lifestyle while pretending to be grateful for the privilege. Jessica's mask had completely fallen away now, revealing the calculating woman who'd been orchestrating our financial destruction for years. You think you can just waltz in and destroy everything I've built? David and I have a history you'll never understand. We have children together. That bond is stronger than whatever temporary infatuation he has with you. You're right about one thing, I replied. I'll never understand how someone could systematically manipulate and defraud people who trusted them, but I'm about to make sure David understands it perfectly. I left Jessica sitting at that cafe table, staring after me with an expression of shock and fury. For the first time in 5 years, she'd been confronted by someone who wasn't intimidated by her tears or swayed by her manipulation tactics. Someone who had evidence of her crimes and the willingness to use it. That evening, I waited until David came home from work before initiating the conversation that would determine the future of our marriage. I'd prepared carefully, organizing all the evidence Tom had gathered into a comprehensive presentation that would be impossible for David to dismiss or rationalize away. David, we need to talk, I said as he settled into his chair with a beer. There are some things about Jessica's financial situation that you need to see. David's expression immediately became defensive. Sarah, we've already discussed this. I know you're not happy about the support payments, but Jessica is struggling, and I can't abandon my children's needs just because it's inconvenient for us. Jessica isn't struggling, I replied, pulling out the folder of evidence. In fact, she's probably wealthier than we are. And she's been systematically lying to you about her financial situation for years, in order to maintain the support payments that have funded her secret investment portfolio. I spent the next hour walking David through every piece of evidence Tom had uncovered. The hidden real estate holdings, the investment accounts, the business partnerships Jessica had concealed from him. The text messages where she'd bragged about manipulating his guilt, the detailed records of her fraud, the proof that every financial crisis had been carefully calculated to extract maximum support from our marriage. David's reactions progressed through denial, anger, and finally a kind of stunned disbelief as the evidence mounted. When I showed him the text messages between Jessica and her sister, I watched something fundamental shift in his expression. "She's been laughing at us," he said quietly, staring at the phone screen. "All these years, every time I've felt guilty about not doing enough for the girls, every time I've worried that Jessica was struggling to provide for them, she's been laughing at how easy it was to manipulate me. She's been stealing from us, David," I corrected. "Using your love for Madison and Morgan as a weapon to commit fraud on a massive scale. And I've been an unwitting accomplice, contributing to our household income while you secretly transferred our shared assets to fund her wealth accumulation." David was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what Jessica had done. When he finally looked up, his expression was pained but resolved. "What do we do now?" he asked. "That depends on what you want our marriage to look like going forward," I replied. "Because I'm done being the understanding wife who accepts financial betrayal for the sake of family harmony. I'm done postponing our dreams while Jessica builds her real estate empire. And I'm done pretending that love means sacrificing my future for someone who views our marriage as a resource to exploit." David reached across the table and took my hand. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never intended for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing for my children." "I know," I said gently, "but intention doesn't undo the damage. Jessica has stolen over $500,000 from our marriage while you've been making me feel selfish for wanting basic financial transparency. She's delayed our plans for starting a family, prevented us from buying a home, and undermined our financial security for 5 years. The question now is what you're going to do about it." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had in our entire marriage. David acknowledged the extent of his deception, the way he'd prioritized avoiding conflict with Jessica over building trust with me. He admitted that he'd been manipulated, but also that he'd chosen to be manipulated because it felt easier than setting boundaries with his ex-wife. More importantly, he agreed to immediate action. We would confront Jessica together, demand restitution for the fraudulent payments, and establish clear boundaries for any future interactions. David would reduce his support to the court-mandated alimony only, with no additional payments regardless of Jessica's claimed emergencies. And if Jessica refused to cooperate, we would pursue legal action to recover the stolen funds. The confrontation with Jessica took place the following weekend at her townhouse, with Madison and Morgan visiting David's parents to avoid involving them in the adult drama. Jessica answered the door, looking polished and confident, clearly expecting this to be another negotiation she could win through tears and manipulation. Her confidence evaporated when she saw both of us standing there with folders full of evidence. "Hello, Jessica," David said calmly. "We need to discuss your financial situation and the support payments I've been making." Jessica's expression flickered between surprise and calculation before settling on injured innocence. "David, what is this about?" "If Sarah has been filling your head with suspicions, Sarah has been showing me facts," David interrupted. "Facts about your real estate investments, your hidden assets, and your systematic fraud. We know about everything, Jessica. The fake financial crises, the manipulation tactics, the text messages where you bragged about how easy it was to steal money from my marriage." I watched Jessica's carefully constructed persona crumble as she realized the extent of what we'd discovered. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known her, She looked genuinely defeated. Those payments were for Madison and Morgan, she said weakly, but even she seemed to know how hollow the words sounded now. Some of them might have been, David replied. But most of them went directly into your personal wealth accumulation, while you lied to me about struggling to survive. You've committed fraud, Jessica, systematic, calculated fraud that has damaged my marriage and stolen years of financial security from Sarah and me. The conversation that followed was brutal but necessary. David outlined the new terms of their financial relationship: court-mandated alimony only, no additional support payments, and immediate restitution for the most egregious fraudulent transfers. Jessica could keep the assets she'd already accumulated, but the steady flow of money from our marriage was ending permanently. Jessica tried every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. She cried, she raged, she threatened to limit David's access to the girls. She accused me of destroying their family. But for the first time in 5 years, David didn't cave to her emotional blackmail. The girls will always be my priority, he told her firmly. But funding your lifestyle at the expense of my marriage isn't helping them. It's teaching them that manipulation and dishonesty are acceptable ways to get what they want. That ends now. 6 months later, David and I had rebuilt our financial foundation and were finally ready to start the family we'd been dreaming of for 5 years. Jessica had agreed to the restitution payments rather than face potential criminal fraud charges, and for the first time since our marriage began, our money stayed in our accounts instead of flowing to David's ex-wife. The townhouse we'd always wanted became a reality, purchased with money that would have otherwise funded Jessica's next investment property. Madison and Morgan adjusted to their father's new boundaries more easily than Jessica had predicted, and our relationship with them actually improved once it wasn't being filtered through their mother's manipulation. As I sat in the nursery of our new home, painting walls for the baby we were expecting in 6 months, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. The woman who'd married David 5 years earlier would never have confronted Jessica, would never have demanded accountability, would never have prioritized her own needs over family harmony. But that woman had been slowly disappearing over years of financial betrayal, replaced by someone stronger, more observant, and unwilling to accept betrayal disguised as love. Jessica had intended to use my marriage as a permanent ATM, but instead she'd inadvertently taught me to value myself enough to fight for what I deserved. David found me there as the sun was setting, paint-splattered and exhausted but happier than I'd been in years. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling his hands on my shoulders as we looked at the room where our child would soon sleep. I leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of a partner who'd finally learned to choose our future over his past. "Just one," I said. I wish I'd been brave enough to demand the truth 5 years sooner. Jessica had taught me an invaluable lesson about the difference between being loving and being a fool. Love didn't require accepting lies, funding betrayal, or sacrificing your dreams for someone else's comfort. Real love demanded honesty, respect, and the courage to fight for the relationship you deserved. And as I felt our baby kick for the first time, I knew that this child would grow up seeing a mother who'd learned to value herself enough to demand better. Jessica's greatest manipulation had ultimately become my greatest gift: the knowledge that I was worth fighting for, and the strength to do it. 3 years had passed since the day I confronted Jessica about her systematic fraud, and life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Our daughter Emma was now 2 years old, running through the halls of our dream home with the boundless energy that only toddlers possess. David had become the partner I'd always hoped for, transparent about finances and protective of our family's future in ways he'd never been during the Jessica years. But sometimes life has a way of testing whether the lessons you've learned have truly taken root, and that test came on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang with Jessica's number flashing on the screen. I hadn't spoken to her directly since our final confrontation 3 years earlier. All communication regarding Madison and Morgan went through David or a family scheduling app, and Jessica had been surprisingly compliant with the boundaries we'd established. The monthly restitution payments had been made on time, David's support had been limited to court-mandated alimony only, and the girls had adapted well to their father's newfound backbone when it came to financial manipulation. So when Jessica's name appeared on my phone, my first instinct was to decline the call. But curiosity won out, and I answered with a cautious "Hello, Jessica. Sarah, thank you for taking my call," Jessica said, her voice unusually subdued. "I know we haven't spoken in years, but I need to talk to you about something important. Something that affects all of us." I moved to the kitchen where Emma was playing with blocks, keeping my voice neutral. "What is it, Jessica?" "I'm getting remarried," she announced, and I could hear something like nervousness in her tone. "His name is Robert, and he's wonderful. We've been together for 8 months, and he proposed last weekend." I waited for the other shoe to drop, knowing that Jessica never called with purely social updates. "Congratulations," I said carefully. "I'm sure Madison and Morgan are excited." "They are," Jessica continued. "But that's actually why I'm calling. Robert has been incredible about accepting the girls as his own, and he wants to adopt them after we're married. He wants to be their legal father, to take full responsibility for their financial support and education." The implications hit me immediately. If Jessica's new husband adopted Madison and Morgan, David's parental rights would be terminated along with his alimony obligations. After 15 years of marriage, divorce and financial manipulation, Jessica would finally be cutting ties completely. "And David knows about this?" I asked. "We're planning to discuss it with him this weekend," Jessica replied. "But Sarah, I wanted to talk to you first because I know how much you've sacrificed over the years. I know that my financial situation caused problems in your marriage, and I wanted you to hear this directly from me." It was the closest Jessica had ever come to acknowledging her manipulation, and I found myself unsure how to respond. Part of me was suspicious, wondering what angle she was working now. But part of me recognized something genuine in her voice, a weariness that suggested she might actually be ready to move on from the twisted dynamic that had defined our families for so long. "Why are you really calling me, Jessica?" I asked. Directly, there was a long pause before she answered. "Because I've been seeing a therapist since Robert and I got serious. She's been helping me understand some things about myself, about the choices I made after my divorce from David. And I've come to realize that I wasn't just hurting you and David with my behavior. I was hurting my daughters too." I set down the coffee mug I'd been holding, giving Jessica my full attention. "I taught Madison and Morgan that manipulation was an acceptable way to get what they wanted," Jessica continued. "I showed them that being a victim could be profitable, that lying about your circumstances was justified if it achieved your goals. And when I think about the kind of women I want them to become, I don't want them to be like the person I was during those years." "What does that mean practically speaking?" I asked. "It means I want to make things right," Jessica said. "I want to pay back the remaining restitution in full instead of dragging it out over the next 2 years. I want to apologize to you properly, not just with words but with actions. And I want to give David the opportunity to decide what kind of relationship he wants with the girls going forward, without the financial entanglement that's complicated everything for so long." I found myself speechless. The Jessica I'd known for 8 years would never have made such an admission, would never have voluntarily given up the financial leverage she'd worked so hard to maintain. Either she was running an incredibly sophisticated long con, or she'd genuinely changed in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Jessica replied. "I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness or to try to rebuild our relationship. I'm calling because I owe you honesty after years of lies, and because I want you to know that Robert has helped me see what a healthy partnership actually looks like." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process the conversation. Emma had moved on from blocks to her toy kitchen, chattering to herself as she prepared an elaborate pretend meal. Watching her play, I realized that this was exactly what I'd fought for during those dark years, the ability to give my child a stable home where money wasn't a weapon and love wasn't conditional. When David came home that evening, I told him about Jessica's call. His reaction was a mixture of relief and skepticism that mirrored my own. "She wants Robert to adopt the girls?" he asked, settling into his chair with a look of profound wariness. "After everything we've been through, she's ready to just walk away." "It sounds like she's ready to move forward," I corrected. "There's a difference. And David, you need to think carefully about what you want. This could be your chance to finally be free of the financial obligations, but it would also mean giving up your legal rights as Madison and Morgan's father." David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at our backyard where Emma's swing set stood ready for tomorrow's adventures. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and sad. "I love Madison and Morgan," he said. "They'll always be my daughters regardless of what any legal document says. But Sarah, I've spent 15 years feeling guilty about their childhood, about the divorce, about not doing enough to make up for the disruption I caused in their lives. Maybe it's time to let them have the stable, uncomplicated family that Jessica and Robert can provide." The meeting between David and Jessica took place the following Saturday at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. I didn't attend, choosing instead to spend the morning with Emma at the park while David decided what the next chapter of his relationship with his daughters would look like. When he returned home 3 hours later, David looked lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. "How did it go?" I asked. "Better than I expected," David replied, sitting on the floor to play with Emma. "Jessica was different, Sarah. More honest than I've ever seen her. She acknowledged what she'd done, how she'd manipulated my guilt and used the girls as leverage to maintain financial control. And she meant it when she said she wanted to make things right." "What did you decide about the adoption?" "I'm going to agree to it," David said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. "Madison is 17 now, Morgan is 15. They're old enough to understand what's happening and to decide for themselves what kind of relationship they want with me going forward. And honestly, I think they'll be better off with Robert as their legal father. He can provide for them without the emotional baggage that's always complicated my relationship with Jessica." I felt a surge of relief that surprised me with its intensity. For 8 years, Jessica had been a shadow over our marriage, a constant source of financial stress and emotional manipulation. The thought that she might finally be ready to move on, to build her own life without using David's guilt as a foundation, felt almost too good to be true. "There's more," David continued. "Jessica is paying off the remaining restitution this week. All of it in one payment, and she's asked me to establish college funds for the girls that she'll contribute to equally, so their education won't be dependent on any future support from us." Over the following months, Jessica proved that her commitment to change was genuine. The restitution payment arrived as promised, allowing us to finally close that chapter of financial manipulation. Madison and Morgan began spending time with us on their own initiative rather than as part of a court-mandated schedule, and their visits became relaxed family time rather than carefully orchestrated performances designed to extract sympathy and money from their father. The adoption proceeded smoothly, with both girls expressing genuine excitement about Robert becoming their official father. They assured David that the legal change wouldn't affect their love for him, and slowly, naturally, they began referring to him as David rather than Dad, a shift that might have been painful years earlier but now felt like healthy evolution. Jessica married Robert in a small ceremony that fall, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely happy rather than calculatingly satisfied. The woman who had spent years orchestrating financial manipulation now seemed content to build a life based on honest partnership rather than elaborate deception. The final test of Jessica's transformation came the following spring, when Madison was accepted to Stanford with a partial scholarship. The remaining tuition would be substantial, and in the past such news would have been accompanied by tearful phone calls about impossible financial burdens and requests for David to sacrifice our family's security for his daughter's education. Instead, Jessica called to share the good news, and to assure David that she and Robert had the tuition covered through Madison's college fund and Robert's education savings plan. She thanked David for years of support that had given Madison opportunities she wouldn't have had otherwise, but made it clear that this was their responsibility now as Madison's legal parents. When David shared the conversation with me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in relation to Jessica in nearly a decade: genuine respect. She had kept her word about taking responsibility for her family's financial future, and she'd done it without drama, manipulation, or attempts to make David feel guilty about stepping back from the provider role he'd occupied for so long. 2 years later, as I watched Emma blow out the candles on her 4th birthday cake, I reflected on how completely our lives had transformed. David had been promoted twice since the Jessica drama ended, advancement that had been possible once he could focus on his career rather than managing constant financial crises. We'd been able to take family vacations without worrying about emergency support requests, to plan for Emma's future education without wondering whether Jessica's next crisis would derail our savings. Most importantly, our marriage had evolved into the true partnership I'd always wanted. David had learned to prioritize our family's needs without the guilt and manipulation that had defined his relationship with Jessica. He'd discovered that being a good father didn't require bankrupting his current family to support his former one, and that healthy boundaries actually strengthened his relationships with Madison and Morgan rather than damaging them. Jessica, meanwhile, had built the stable life she'd always claimed to want. Her marriage to Robert appeared to be thriving, based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Madison was excelling at Stanford, and Morgan was preparing for her own college applications with the confidence that comes from knowing her education was secure. For the first time since her divorce from David, Jessica was living authentically rather than performing perpetual victimhood. As for me, I'd learned lessons that extended far beyond financial management and marriage dynamics. I discovered that love doesn't require accepting abuse, that kindness doesn't mean enabling manipulation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. The woman who'd married David 8 years earlier had been willing to sacrifice her dreams indefinitely, for the sake of family harmony. The woman I'd become understood that real harmony could only exist when relationships were built on honesty, respect, and mutual accountability. Emma's laughter filled our backyard as she chased soap bubbles with the focused determination that only small children possess. David caught my eye across the party and smiled, and in that moment I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you fought for something valuable and won. Jessica had taught me, inadvertently, that I was worth fighting for. She'd shown me that accepting less than I deserved would only encourage others to give me less than I deserved. And in the end, her manipulation had made me stronger, more observant, and more committed to building relationships based on truth rather than convenience. As the sun set on Emma's birthday party and our guests began to head home, I realized that Jessica's greatest gift to me hadn't been her eventual honesty or transformation. It had been the crisis that forced me to discover who I really was beneath the accommodating facade I'd worn for so many years. Sometimes the people who hurt us most teach us the most valuable lessons about ourselves. Jessica had been an unwitting teacher, showing me through her manipulation exactly what I wouldn't accept and exactly what I was capable of when pushed too far. For that lesson, as painful as it had been to learn, I was finally and genuinely grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.